So welcome back to Building Safety Faces. I'm Matt Hodges-Long and delighted to be joined today by David Wales from Shared Aim. So David, thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Matt. It's a pleasure to be with you.
No worries. So can you talk us through Shared Aim? What does Shared Aim do? And we'll then work out how that relates to building safety.
Of course. Shared Aim really hints at the idea that we need to bring together to find a common purpose and multiple different viewpoints. I think many experiences we would see through our lens and interpret it in one way. And in truth, as we find in everyday life, people have different takes on the same experience, and neither is wrong. And so through Shared Aim, we try and really understand events at a human level and find the bit that binds us together, whilst accepting that actually there are some differences around that. So ultimately we work in the customer experience space, but as I say, really understanding human level. And part of that is traditionally marketing and other organizational processes have sought to put us into a single category, to understand us in a way that helps them manage a business and plan a business, and create a certainty about how we will be and how we'll respond. And I think the reality is we change very frequently. Relationships, monetary pressures, health, all those things will have an impact on how we feel on any given day. And I think for any experience that you want to create, any way you want to understand people, actually we need to come into that space as being a human first, and then see the world from that perspective, rather than try and create what I'd argue is a false certainty. We are inherently as humans complicated, changeable, and not easy to understand. And that's fine if you work from that point of view. There are ways to create things that actually meet my needs, but you won't do it by trying to find the single definitive version of me, because there isn't one. If that helps explain in that way.
It's really good, and then I suppose the thing that probably everybody would be thinking is, what's this got to do with the building safety crisis? So talk us through your how you get involved in this and why you have an opinion on this particular subject.
Of course. I arrived at this probably in quite an unusual way, even in the customer experience sector. My background is quite unusual. I spent 30 years in the fire service, and for the last 10 years, I led a study that really sought to understand why people behaved in a way that was different to the advice that we gave or to our expectations. Now, up to that point, I'd had a fairly traditional career, and at that stage, I was in my dream job, really. I was running the fire investigation team and the research function. And it really intrigued me, this question of, so why are we seeing things different to our advice? And in truth, it really struck me at that point, I'd never really asked the public their experience. I joined the fire service because it's a job I wanted to do. It clearly does good for people, and that was a great drive. But in truth, I joined it because it's the sort of job that I was attracted to. And in the first 20 years, I had contact very regularly with people that had fires and other emergencies. But when I spoke to them, it was generally because I needed something from them to understand for my role in terms of the forms we had to complete or some other aspect of the work. And when we got this question about why aren't people behaving as we expect, the first phase of the study, we just sat down with people informally, 10 people who'd had minor fires and minor injuries, and said to them, tell us your story in your words. And for the first time ever, I heard the end-to-end story, not just the snippets that were useful to me. And it really struck me that having spent all that time training for process and in the technical perspective of fire, the stories people told me were very personal.
So at that time, prior to doing this work, how would the fire service have expected those 10 people to behave?
The advice we had and is still given out is simply that you hear the alarm or you become aware of the fire and you just exit the building. In the domestic property, that's the expectation. Get out, stay out, call us out. And behind that is a presumption that the public are potentially incapable or put themselves at too high a risk in tackling the fires. And I'm sure, as we'll cover a bit later, that's not a view that the research demonstrates to be the case. But my expectation at that time was really that people should just get out and wait for the professional response to arrive, and we would put the fire out.
And what did those 10 people actually do then in reality? How did they actually behave was different to the expectation?
I think the study, we wanted to understand people that survived fires, because actually a lot of the work and research is where people have sadly died as a result of the fire. And because there's a process around that, you learn a lot about what can be found out about the circumstances and actions. But we thought actually the majority of people get out very safely. So what is it we could learn and promote about the successful ways they do that, rather than just learn when it goes wrong? And these people told us that they were very different to the people that we thought of before. These were very able. They undertook a range of actions. It was important to them to do things like warn other people. One of the things that came out really early on was 10 of the people had pets. 8 of the 10 had pets. 7 of those said their behavior was primarily driven about concern for the pets, because for many of them, that pet was a companion that had the same status as another member of the family or somebody else. We'd never understood that before. When I heard it intuitively, it's just obvious. You know, people care about pets in that way. But all the data analysis we'd looked at from our perspective, we'd never thought to test that. So after all those years, when we just kept saying to people, just get out, get out, get out, and never said to them, so what's important to you and how can we help you? If we had done that, we would have quickly understood pets matter, possessions matter. A laptop can be just a laptop, or it can actually have all of your contacts, your business details, your things that matter to you, in which case you won't see it as a laptop, you'll see it for what it contains. And I think it really became apparent that there are some practical things people want to do. So they'll tackle the fire, they'll want to investigate smoke, or the smoke alarm can be ambiguous. You know, they're not things we run away from normally without investigating. But feeling they did the right thing matters as well, as say alerting other people, even if they didn't necessarily know them, but in buildings, particularly where there's other occupants, it matters to them to tell that. And so we built this picture up of, rather than just hearing a single alarm and running away, people wanted to investigate what caused the noise. And often they would find it a small fire that they could tackle, and other effects that they could do to mitigate, should the fire develop in the early stages, the things that they could do to protect themselves. And even the role of embarrassment. Many people described to us that they wanted to avoid the fire service arriving, because when we did, we arrived with 2 fire appliances normally, make a lot of noise, all the neighbours knew. And so actually things like that, at a very human level, we never thought about. We just thought about, there's a fire, you'd obviously call us. But when you heard the stories from the people, as I say, I think about a third or fourth interview, it just made me realise I've really not understood what a fire experience is like from somebody who didn't expect it, who didn't want it, whereas I come to work every day on the opposite side of that.
So is there much evidence, if you look into it, of people that have died in dwelling fires that wouldn't have died if they hadn't have tried to fight it? Is there any evidence of sort of incremental deaths that if they'd have just left and shut the door, they would still be alive today? Is that understood? Or
I would argue from the research we undertook, both of our own primary research and other studies, that is one of the myths. In general terms, the people that are likely to die in a fire are at risk because they're unable to respond either through physical or mental impairment in a way that is appropriate to the potential risk. That is a very small group. And obviously for those understanding who they are, preventing the fire in the first place or providing some degree of protection should the fire occur is incredibly important. They rely on the input of others. But by far the majority of people are very capable in terms of the actions they take. They are never at risk of anything more than a minor injury. And again, one of the things we found in the study that was fascinating to me was they all said, almost without exception, the minor injury they incurred, was reasonable for what they were able to achieve. What they self-appointed tasks they had, what was important to them, they did not see a minor injury as something that would change the course of action should they do it again. And we are talking about minor injuries. And I think that's one of the fallacies that probably policies at the moment are built on, that we'll all start off with this equal risk of a fatal outcome in a fire. The imagery around it, the language around the messaging, every fire, every second counts, fire kills, the dramatic imagery of well-established fires, they are fortunately very rare. most people that encounter a fire will encounter something very small in the early stages that poses minor risk and that they are capable of dealing with. And they do so without any support at the moment, really, from the fire sector or many of the other agencies around that.
So we're not actually training people to take immediate actions, other than the immediate action be to run away. And that seems to me, when we were talking about this before, that to my mind, if I equate that to sort of first aid, that yes, you call 999, but you also administer first aid if you possibly can, and it's safe to do so, and there's somebody on the end of the line that can talk you through it. And is that because in the fire sense, it's at that point, it's property that you're protecting rather than preserving somebody? You know, the patient is a property as opposed to a person. So there's a different mindset, or is it just because we haven't evolved our solution provision in the way that the medical services have, in terms of being able to administer that treatment at the roadside, if you like, over the phone? What's the disconnect?
I suspect there are a number of factors to it. One is very much that perception. And one of the things that we found, we did look at a burn survivor journey and again, do a piece of research and report on that. And what you realise is the only person that ever sees end to end is the survivor, because there are multiple agencies, all meaning well, all doing a great role, but they all do that by and large on the terms of which they understand, whether that's driven by the legislation, historical approaches. But nobody sees end to end. And I think certainly from the fire service role, we would see it that we would undertake rescues, hand them to the ambulance, and then they move further down the line from ambulance care to hospital care to specialist rehabilitation and so on. But what we found, certainly with the burn survivors, in doing that is you miss opportunities to get outcomes for people, and not just saving life. The quality of life that you get for people matters immensely. And even minor injuries can be life-changing. And even life-threatening, we found. Not all injuries are equal. And I think this genericism is something that really doesn't help us at all, as I say, whether it's understanding the risk of a fire in the first place, the risk of injury or the impact of different people. The other bit I suspect is that we're not really applying risk management in a way that looks at this properly. So we know that dwelling fires, despite there being very few numbers in terms of injuries, they do count for a disproportionate number of injuries to the other fires we see. And just in the last 25 years, the response time to dwelling fire and other fires has gone up by about 50%. And it's very difficult to control that. Obviously, you've got fixed distance to move an asset to the place where it's needed. And so it's not something you can do much about. But during that period, we do know if you took a risk management approach, you have a dynamic event, it's still active, you've got people there, and we know it's causing disproportionate injuries, albeit at a relatively small level. And so when you stand back and think, and we still do nothing with that, we're still saying you've got to get a physical response there. And I think exactly as you say, if we look at health now, remote assistance is the way to go. And I think certainly when you understand that the majority of people are never going to have a fire, and if they do have a fire, there'll never be anything risk of more than minor injury, we tend not to think of fire as a risk in the way that we do crime or some other things. We don't see it daily. And we don't really want people to worry about that daily. And so I would argue that actually, rather than a mass pre-education of telling people what to do in the event of a fire, most of the people probably aren't interested because it's not going to happen to me, or it may not happen to me for years. I think we've got to be better at helping people at the moment. So you can keep a simple message, which is, if you're worried by a fire, however size, whatever size, cool. But what you then get is immediate support in the way that you do through health, rather than we will be there in 5 or 20 minutes, whatever the response time is.
That's
and
really
I think that's
really good point, actually, Dave. Just to jump in on that, this sort of thinking that somebody said to me the other day, I think it's probably 5 or 6 years ago, that I did a first aid course. And my wife's a teacher, so she does them very regularly. And I said something about, oh, well, you know, CPR, you do that. And she said, no, that's changed. The guidance has changed. And I thought, actually, I can't properly remember what I learned back then. And so if I met somebody in the street tomorrow that needed CPR, I think I probably might have an idea of what maybe I should do, but I would certainly prefer an expert or somebody with a laminated sheet in a call center to say, this is exactly what you do. The evidence now says you don't do 20 of that, you do 30 in one go. Yeah. Okay, I'll do 30, thank you very much. But back to that point, the population can't carry that level of specialist knowledge around in their heads. So, back to that point of, do I use the powder extinguisher or the water one? I can't quite remember it. I'm sure I learned this at school back in the day, but but if somebody told me, yeah, use the one on the right, use the one that says this. Okay, great, thank you very much. So I think you're training people to ring 999, aren't you, and say, I need the fire service. That's what you want people to remember, and I think that's probably
and I think the defibrillators, I think, are a great parallel. I'm sure in the 1960s, having that sort of technology would have filled the room up and needed 6 specialists. But somebody realised that this is no good. By the time people arrive here, it's too late. We need this sort of care at the community level when somebody first has the problem. And so you've moved from that specialist and highly sort of remote system to let's get it where it's needed. And I think the defibrillator is a great example, that they are designed in a way that's intuitive. We can pick these up and use them reasonably confidently, and we've also got the ability to phone and have that live support with us. And I think for me, if we sometimes step back from trying to improve what we've got, because many of our institutions and approaches have got their origins way back in 50s and post-war models, and they've done a great job for us. But I think technology offers us the way to look at something different and come up with different solutions in areas. And I think remote support for me is one of the big areas that if you expand that, we can help more people more effectively. We've got technology that everyone's carrying around with us now. We can create video links, we can make that personal, we can see what people were doing, we can reassure them. And again, that period of time when you're waiting for a response, we know from the research we did, people would say, but it took you 20 minutes to get here. And I could look at the sheets, it took 5, but I understand why you'd think that. And then they would describe that prior to calling us, they'd done all these actions and it had only taken about a minute. And you think, there's no way it could have done. But when we're busy, time goes quickly.
Yeah.
When you're waiting, standing around, particularly when something that you value is being affected and harmed, that seems a very long time. And to put the phone down on somebody and say, we'll be there, that's when we get there. Actually, psychologically, that's a really tough one to deal with. And I think my argument would be the evidence points to we need to reimagine this. We need to come back. What is the problem we're trying to solve? How do we use technology and other solutions, and certainly embedded in the community? How do we get that resilience where it's really needed?
So is there no, at the moment with the fire and rescue service then, so if you have a fire in your house and it's terrible, nobody dies or whatever, what is the investigation process in relation to, I understand the sort of the material investigation and the categorization, but in terms of is there any debrief with the occupants of the house to say what actually happened and talk me through the timeline and what was or do the people sort of get excluded? Is it more about this move from three through 2 levels or 2 compartments within the flat, into 2 from the source point of origin, and very sort of technical stuff, as opposed to what did the people do and how did they react and how long did things take? Is there any sort of chronology of that? Or
no, it's one of the things that we found, as I say, when we sat with people and heard their stories, I thought, none of this has come through to me before. I've never heard this. So what you have is data collection for post-incident that's informed by national standards. So there's a number of categories that are collected so they can be published nationally, and then there's the ability for services to add some local data. But we don't capture the human story. And I think, again, that's that effect of the public are not present in the data or the policy formation. So their contribution is ignored. It's assumed to be, back to that point of, we don't expect the public to do anything, so there's no decision making. They will just hear something and get out. They do not. There's numerous decisions that the public make. There's numerous beneficial actions they take. So for 70 to 80% of fires in the UK, and I think it's even higher in the States, they deal with the fire without ever calling the fire service. We're not asking, what is it they're doing? We're just saying, you shouldn't have done that. And if anyone gets injured, we say, well, that's because you didn't call us. The reality is the public are the first and largest part of the fire response we have in the UK and almost every country in the world. They're not visible in strategies. We don't credit them as saying this is the first line of response, and then certain ones will require specialist professionals. And they're not present even through social science. They're not present on a lot of the policy formation or the standards and advice. And I've looked at it quite extensively, and they tend to refer back to quantitative technical standards and similar bodies, and say that engineering perspective is great, but it doesn't tell you the human story. And we're in the business of reducing the impact of fire on people. Buildings, I know insurers will have a slightly different view, and I obviously appreciate that. But ultimately, we want to reduce the harm to people from fires. That's, for most of us, the first point. Buildings can be replaced. And the reality is we're not learning. And I think part of it is down to the focus on response time, which I think creates a policy blind spot. It's a failing policy. It's gone up 50% over the last 25 years. And yet it's crucial on the outcome, because you've got that window to stop a fire when it's small before it starts to spread. And I think, as I say, we've really got to look back and say, why are we not doing something better with that time, with the resources we've got? And the reality is exactly the same as we said to the defibrillator. What you've got to work with is the people that are going to discover the fire in the first place. So rather than assume that they do nothing of use, that they'll panic, which they don't, there's no evidence at all of that, recognize what they do, because it's already there. We know that from the evidence. If we work with that, provide them the right support, we will actually improve fire safety. If we keep shouting at people, just get out, pretending they're doing nothing useful, we can't advance fire safety, because we've got this massive disconnect between what's actually happening and what policy and professional response assumes is the case.
So one of the big, for this audience, one of the big hot potatoes at the moment is the imposition of waking watch. So that move from stay put to simultaneous evacuation, and in the absence of a fire alarm, the need to replace that fire alarm with human beings in yellow jackets. We struggle to find where the evidence base, I think it doesn't exist for whether that's an effective policy or not, but in terms of the formulation of the policy as to real engagement and understanding of human behaviour, both on the behalf of the waking watch operatives, but also the residents within the buildings that live in the buildings. And it just seems to me as to be a big missed opportunity to actually understand what actually happens at scale. I mean, what are your thoughts there in terms of evidence, sociology, human behaviour, etc.?
No, I think you're right. And as I say, it's I don't know whether it's cultural or mindset, but the biggest shift we've got to get is to recognise that we are all effectively working to improve public safety. And you can't do that if you exclude the public from any of those conversations, or just treat them as if they're incapable and make no contribution. Everyone brings something to it. And I suppose it goes back to why I called the company Shared Aim. This isn't about the public or the professionals or policymakers. It's about all of us and the perspective we bring. And the social side, even when I've looked at the research, the fire service and fire sector generally, compared to health, education, crime, suffers from very little active research. A lot of the research that takes place is conditioned on, it's very generic about how it talks about risk. It confuses and interchanges the talk about risk of a fire starting, of it incurring an injury, of it. So there's very little precision that really helps. It's still this, as I say, flawed generic approach of everyone's at the same risk and it's always the worst case scenario, which is to say not the case. But it also suffers from, it looks at the studies that I've seen tend to look at it from, this is how we do it. So it looks through current policy lenses, rather than just drawing back and saying, from a grounded base, what is this evidence suggesting to us? What would I develop if I just looked at the whole of it? And as I say, you have to understand the whole story as a whole. The fire starts, from our perspective, when somebody first notices something's different. And I think where this corrupts in some ways policy is, even if you look at the role of the smoke alarm, the statistics that are put out about the role of smoke alarm will tell you it's 8 times more likely to save a life. When you bring in 2 other factors, one which is that it's based on the fires that the fire service attend, which we know is only 20 to 30% of all fires and probably the more serious ones. Yeah. you've already taken out 70 to 80% of fires that would reduce that statistics already. Within the fires that the fire service tend, and generally we found that when we asked people, what was the first thing that alerted you to something being different? You may not know it's a fire, but what was the first thing? The first two things were smelt smoke, saw smoke, often because as in the room, it may be a kitchen fire. The third thing was the smoke alarm. So it's not, but what the fire service recorded, and this back to your point, is we asked, did the fire alarm sound? You said, or smoke alarm sound? Yes. You don't ask, is that what first alerted you to the fire? So it may have sounded by the time you was already aware and doing something to mitigate the fire.
Yeah.
And
so your nose might be the most effective piece of equipment in the house at that time to alert you to the fact that there's a fire, for example.
Yeah. And
as opposed to the smoke alarm that is the third. Yeah, I get you. Right.
Yeah. And so back to your point about how do things like Wake and Watch come out? If you're not asking the right questions and looking at the right information, you end up with best guess. Because the other bit with the smoke alarm is, in our studies, we never found any difference between the smoke alarm or any other means as to what people did. So this idea that the smoke alarm is the thing that alerts most people to a fire is not the case. It probably does for about a third of the fires. It's not to say it hasn't got an important role, particularly at night, but it's not the role that's portrayed. But also, the behaviour people exhibit when they hear an alarm or the smell of smoke is no different. It doesn't mean that if you hear the smoke alarm, you just run straight out in a way that you wouldn't anywhere else. So the smoke alarm doesn't save you. It just tells you possibly something's different, but it doesn't of itself make that difference. And I think back to your point about Wake and Watch, I'm intrigued, I think is probably the best way to put it, as to what the efficacy of that is and what other solutions we could have adopted that would have been more robust in the last 3 years, because I don't know where the evidence base for that sits. I'm not sure what evaluation is ongoing, but certainly given the sums of money that this is costing people, I'm surprised that as a matter of public interest, that's not more transparent.
Yes, I think I would tend to agree with you there, and well, strongly agree with you. But I think that a couple of things that I wanted to run. One thing that we do need to talk about is your new research that you've just published around the role of fire extinguishers, which I think to most people on the face of it would think, well, okay, really, do I want to read that? But actually, it's fascinating about. I think fire extinguishers as not only as a thing in themselves, but in terms of the wider conversation of how you would employ a fire extinguisher and why you would employ it and how you would educate it and why don't we have them available to us like a defibrillator. So talk us through then some of the key findings without sort of spoiling the whole thing, which obviously we will put the notes in the YouTube channel and on our website and on Twitter, etc., about how to download a copy of your research. But talk us through some of the key findings.
Yeah, I've got to agree. It's not the most promising title for a bestseller, is it? But I think actually it did provide a vehicle, and you may be aware that in the Grenfell report, phase 1, it says that they were unable to recommend the use of fire extinguishers. And that did strike me as odd, given what I'd already knew about how people tackle fires and the numbers of people that are doing it prior. And so we kind of looked into that a bit more. And as you say, it talks about the fire extinguisher, but what I've done is look at it from a human perspective. So not what the legislation say not so much what is the guidance to professionals and risk assessors. Why would I as an individual have one of these and use it? And it taps into those things, because I know that if you look at the guidance, the assumption again is that you have an extinguisher in the common area to protect the common area so people can just run out because they've heard the alarm, and we play out those same things. I think, but it's not the case. You know, the people are very capable in lots of private dwelling houses, because they aren't supported to do so, because they won't have an extinguisher, they're putting fires out still very successfully with improvised means, so buckets of water and whatever's to hand. But what I found fascinating, so you've got this disconnect between policy assumptions and the reality of why an extinguisher is valuable. And again, we suffer from the evidence base. So you'll be aware that one of the things that comes out is there's in many dwelling properties where there's multiple dwellings, so student accommodation, places like that, extinguishers either have been removed or not been applied to the common areas, because the guidance is quite strong in certain documents to say the public must be trained, and if you can put these somewhere where the public who aren't trained could use them, it represents an unacceptable risk. I can't find any evidence of this. It's not a lot of data collected around use of extinguishers and that, but certainly studies from America and the available data strongly refute that. And I think there's some interesting discussions around things like standards. Standards have a great role to play in setting a minimum benchmark. But actually, if we genuinely think that people struggle with using extinguisher, then you bring in design. And probably within a year.
Just cut in there, David. So we were talking before about defibrillators. So if somebody has a heart attack on the pavement and you can get to a defibrillator, you can expose their chest, stick on electrodes, and shock their heart back into rhythm. So a human being can do that without training, but they can't point a fire extinguisher at a small fire. Is effectively what, from a policy perspective, the two schools of thought at the moment, just to bring it down to reality. I mean, that's my take.
It is, and I think, as I say, we used to teach that. We used to teach people to dampen a tea towel, approach the fire, lay it over hot liquids. So what you've got is this real difference. From public policy, it seems to be saying we do not accept any injury to any person in relation to fire. I can drive my car, I can use DIY tools, I can do all these other things which are inherently more dangerous than the sort of fire I'll tackle. And again, in the report, I've looked at what does the data tell us about the fires that you or I are likely to encounter. They're small. About 50% of fires are discovered, and this is for fires that the fire service are called to, so not even the ones before, the smaller ones. But 50% are still on the item first ignited. They don't spread beyond that. 70, 80 or even more percent never leave the room of origin. So most fires are very small. And what we find, as I say, is that if we really thought about the design side of it, we accept the public are capable, which they are, we could design products in the way that the defibrillator has and say, right, what do we need to put around that person if we feel there's a risk to make them safer? But the public have already said, to protect the things that are the most valuable to us in my home, the people I love, the pets, the possessions, I will take some risk. And a minor injury is the acceptable trade-off. Whereas the government policy seems to be, no, you must not have any injuries at all associated with this. And again, these gaps mean that fundamentally we cannot move fire safety forward because you're not having the same conversation. And the reality is the public behaviours, the more I looked at it, the public makes sense. I understand entirely the way they behave. I understand entirely the way they behave. It's what I would do. It's what nearly all my colleagues would do, in truth, when I spoke to them. And yet we're still trying to force them to conform to an ideal of a policy or professional assumption that you will never do. You won't change those behaviours. They've been established. They're intuitive. They tap into some very primal things of protect what I love. Quite rightly, and the public are capable of doing that. And I think the role of the fire safety sector and fire service now needs to be, so how do we allow you to do the things that are important to you safely? We've got a different role.
What is the future then, do you think, of stay put? Because the recent government's fire safety consultation and the government response graded by respondent the viability of stay put. And when from a resident's, I can't remember the exact percentage now, but it was a huge percentage of residents responding that just said, we do not trust, we do not believe in stay put. Whereas I think the industry professionals' view was far higher in terms of its efficacy. But the reality is, I think this sort of, to me, jumped out when Jacob Rees-Mogg said in the comments, I don't want to misquote him, but effectively in a discussion post-Grenfell, almost got in trouble for it, was saying, well, of course, common sense would say, of course you get out of a building. And it got a lot of trouble for it, etc. But, obviously, because I think we're talking about the fact that people were being specifically told to stay put. We've got evidence that's come in recently from a fire in the Midlands where people were evacuating the building in a simultaneous evac building, were being told to go back up the stairs by the fire service. They wanted to come up the staircases. So psychologically, can we defend selling stay put to residents? I mean, or is that battle lost, do you think, based on what everybody knows now?
I can only give a personal perspective, which is that if I felt threatened, I would leave. And I would do that as soon as I felt threatened. I think that's my absolute right to do so. And I think it again comes back to it's a very odd position. I think if you don't understand what that threat looks like, and if you don't live in a flat and on a higher floor and actually live with that fear every day, and I think it comes back to, we saw that with the police many years ago. The fear of crime is as much of an issue as the reality of crime. And in fact, real crime is relatively low, but the fear of crime affects many more people. Particularly at the moment with the cladding and all the other issues, the fear of fire is disproportionately high. But if you keep excluding people from the conversation, if you keep excluding the people affected from the solutions, you can't address that. Fortunately, it's very unlikely that another fire will happen. The sadness is whether that would be enough to prevent a tragedy on the scale we've seen again. I don't know. I'm not sure that I personally feel that there's enough been done to address the root cause of the problems to have confidence that's the case. But I find it an odd position that in fire safety policy, which is almost unlike almost any other policy area, you would tell people to stay in a building that's at risk. I think we all have the personal choice. And certainly if I felt threatened, I would leave at that point. From a fire service perspective, I would rather have turned up at an empty building, if I knew it was an empty building, everyone evacuated, than I would to have to spend a lot of time trying to work out who people are, where they are, and hope that I can get to them in time. That's a difficult proposition. I'm not saying that I could offer a solution. I would always say that this is a debate that needs inputs from all the stakeholders, and I think to continue to impose solutions from professionals, if the professionals have experience in sort of living on the 20th floor for 3 years and understand what it looks like, the lived experience matters. If you're living in a single house where you're free of actually understanding what that feels like day to day, then you can't offer that perspective. You can bring your professional expertise, but I think this is a debate that has to include all voices on an equal footing, not just as a token consultation.
Yeah.
We are trying to protect the people that live in those buildings. If they say we're going to get out as soon as we feel threatened, then you adapt your policy, you adapt your response, because ultimately we want lives saved. The building can be replaced. If that means that they're going to get out and make that choice. And in fact, our study showed that about 50% of people during a fire, of the ones we looked at, dwelling fires, never left the property. And when I told my colleagues that, they were all saying, that's dangerous, they shouldn't. Because in their mind, these were these fires that could in seconds erupt into an inferno. The reality is, for most people, it's a very small fire, as I say, contained to one item, maybe a bit of smoke out the toaster. They were never in any danger beyond the inconvenience of a bit of smoke or that. Yeah. And another 21% went back in the building one or more times, not because they're stupid, but because it was a very small fire, a very low risk, and they were capable of managing their behaviour and activities and often putting the fire out. So again, I keep coming back to it. There's such a disconnect between what policies are based on, the exceptional, rare, worst case scenario, against the reality of what most people need on a day-to-day basis. They are different solutions, they're different problems, but they all have to, and I would argue very much, they have to be fully informed and respective of what the residents want. We cannot impose solutions on people, literally when it is a life and matter and death in this case.
So have you seen any robust research or funding for research then in terms of the human factors that we're talking about in the context of sort of post-Grenfell research? Because undoubtedly there is a much higher level of perceived threat from a resident's perspective when you're being told, well, the reason that your property insurance is now 10 times what it was last year is because you've got flammable cladding or issues, you've got to have yellow jacketed people patrolling the corridors with air horns. You're a moment away from having a prohibition notice from the local fire and rescue service, the yada, 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 that psychologically yes, I'm hyper aware now of something that I might not have considered before, but that has a massive impact on me mentally. Is there any research going on that you've seen that actually sort of tries to understand this evolving picture?
No, and I think in the picture you paint, what we're seeing is a continuation of the pre-Grenfell conditions, where every stakeholder imposes their criteria. So the insurers obviously believe that there's a higher risk, they then increase the premiums. And so everyone brings their perspective. For me, one of the things that I saw before Grenfell continues, we have a huge number of stakeholders, or each with different roles to play within this. And somehow we've assumed that they're naturally self-organising, that the sum of the parts would be that they will all focus on public safety. And the reality is it doesn't work like that. So we're almost examining a fire safety sector as a system when it was never conceived as such and it never operated as such. And to an extent, as you describe it quite rightly, you now see the response quite fragmented in the way that each of the stakeholders has then thought, well, what's that mean to us? How do we mitigate the risk to our organisation? And so I respect that, that they all have a role and accountabilities as individual organisations. But if we actually want to make progress, then you have to look at a whole solution, which starts with the residents. We co-create. And so you see this in health. I think there's a report published previously, Saving Lives is Not Enough, and very much spoke about that approach, that in health, they're starting to talk quite strongly, and you see it in their 10-year strategy, about being very much citizen-led. It's a long way to go with that. It's a big challenge, but we have to remind ourselves why we exist in the first place. And it goes from rather than command and control to support and empower. And I think that's what we've got to do with our communities. Start with them and say, right, what do we know about your needs and your requirements of us? How can we help you develop that? But at the moment, we are just seeing this almost protective approach where everyone then says, we're going to have to do this, we're going to have to do this to mitigate our risk as organisations. And unfortunately, I think the residents are picking up quite literally the cost of that in every respect. And as you say, it may be there, for the some of the solutions are being put in place, but I'm not sure what the evidence base is.
Just sort of jumping in on sort of, if we look at the Hackett sort of building a safer future and what we should do with high risk buildings if they are actually high risk, let's call them tall buildings, is the sort of the whole concept of the building as a system, and it's a machine, it delivers an outcome, understand all of that and conceptually agree with it, but the amount of change that is required across multiple organizations that aren't one system, as you've identified, even within fire, it's not one harmonious interconnected unit, that you then expand into other areas of safety, and then you multiply that by tens, if not hundreds of thousands of buildings, and then put in the complexity of millions of residents living within those buildings. I don't think anyone's really thought through the ability to change or overcome the inertia. If just looking at the fire safety consultation the other day, with there were 70 or 80 proposals there that people were talking about. Well, and one of them, just one line item, was around a national standard for simplified building plans showing riser locations, etc., that could be shared by the responsible person with the local fire and rescue service. So if you just took that as a piece of activity, you divided that by 50 fire and rescue services with different systems, however many thousands of responsible persons, people that draw the plans, agreeing a standard, that one of 90, and this is a proposal that came from the Grenfell and Tower Inquiry Phase 1 report recommendations nearly 2 years ago, and the government have now said we're going to implement by October this year. And that's that's months, years worth of work, I think, to try and achieve that. Yeah. And it's one of many. And I don't think anyone's really ever said, so I'm like a stuck record with people say, well, that's an interesting idea. How are we going to do that 300,000 times? I talk about things, we need to do this at scale. That's what that means. We're not talking about 200 oil rigs across the country or 400 petrochemical plants. And I think, to my mind, that I think is the big missing part of all the Hackett work, is people from outside of the property management industry have been brought in to advise and to develop policy, but we've missed the lived reality of what is it like to manage a portfolio of 800 high-rise buildings in a housing association or a council? You know, what do people do when they live in their homes? You know, how do they behave? How do they hoard? How do they cram? How do they might sublet? They might think that they want to park something in the communal stairway. You know, that's real life, and that seems to be missing from the theory of all of these building safety reforms. And I don't know how we kind of intervene and say, come on, you've got to talk to real people here and understand. You go out and build a safety case for a building, Dame Judith. You know, go and flat entrance door inspection, go and try and burst your way into a sample of flats where people don't want to let you in for whatever reason, to check the closers. You know, the how is, we've kind of got the why, but we haven't got the how, and that's my real concern with all of this.
I'm not sure what would drive the change, and I'm not sensing there's an appetite for it, but I would argue we've reached a point where the foundations are not strong enough anymore. There's too many flaws, there's too many assumptions, and we can keep putting plasters on, and you can make individual recommendations. Will it improve things? I don't think it will, because I don't think we've got a common purpose. I don't think yet we've understood, and say the articulation of, are we trying to stop any fire deaths in residential buildings? Is that the aim? Is it we're going to try and stop all injuries, which is the premise behind the current model, which actually inhibits the ability of people to get support when they're tackling the vast majority of fires that they do? Because if they didn't do that, the fire brigade faces a 4 to 5 times increase in calls. It couldn't handle that. If it went to, if people followed the advice it gave and went to every fire, it couldn't deal with it. So I think we've got to somehow pull back and say, can we just clarify the problem we're trying to solve? And that has to be strongly influenced by the residents' voice. I think you see it in many areas now. If we understand the human need, then actually technology allows us to look at the world in a different way. And I would argue if we're trying to repair the current system, exactly as you say, it'll become overwhelming. And what happens then is we spend 3 years making recommendations, of which, if we're lucky, 10% kind of get implemented, but probably not in the way that they were intended. And you lose the benefits and you lose confidence, which is more important. I think we are at a point where we have the ability in so many ways to have that conversation, to understand the needs of everyone, to put that in a way that then is deliverable. Technology, if we look at what's happening with AI, machine learning, all those things, it takes out a lot of human process. And I think the sectors that really understand this are using that to become more human, because it allows their staff not to be lost, but actually to become more directly involved in frontline human engagement, which is, I think, during the pandemic, we've all felt that distance from people and in person, that loss of human connectivity is the bit we all miss most.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important for us to understand. So I wouldn't necessarily endorse particular individual measures on where we are now, because I just think from what I've looked at, and I offer one perspective, not, sort of, certainly not necessarily all encompassing, but I don't think we've got strong enough foundations to build something that's going to be resilient and appropriate for the next 10, 15 years. I think we've got to pull back and ask the fundamental questions of, do we know what we're trying to deliver, and do we have the right data? Because we cannot keep scaring people. So you mentioned about research. A lot of the studies look at about fire development. They'll have a building and they'll put a fire in it, and then they come up with survivability time. I don't think many, if any, of those studies include the human behaviour. So they then say, here's a building, the only determinant of a good outcome is the fire development. The evidence from real fires shows that to be very different. They're small fires, they're not developing that way. So there's something different. But if policy is informed by some of the studies that show this, you've got 8-minute survivability, You then get to, you've got to get everyone out or stay put, and you just think, let's get the data lined up. Let's have an honest conversation about what we genuinely know and what we're assuming. I've got no problem with assumptions. We need those in every part of our life. But you have to be clear when you're making an assumption and when you know something.
Yeah.
Because an assumption on an assumption on an assumption means you're guessing.
Well, this is where I struggle, because part of me looks at the empirical evidence of fire deaths in the UK and the trend, which is generally downwards over time.
Yeah.
Obviously, with Grenfell being an anomaly, if you like, thankfully an anomalous event along the way. So simplistically, you could look at it and say, well, okay, well, the likelihood of us dying in a fire over time is reducing. But then there is the other part which says, well, okay, well, we can't ignore the sort of low probability, high consequence events like Grenfell. So what is the data telling us? And where, if we take something in a high-rise building like a dry riser, which is sort of, hopefully you're never actually going to need to deploy in anger, but when you do, you want to know that it's going to work, because that's your sort of catastrophe loss part. Because if you say 90% of those fires are going to be put out by the person in the flat of origin, you might only need to use the dry riser 10% for 10% because you've got to squirt water. But that shouldn't be to say, well, okay, from a policy perspective, we're not going to have this equipment then. We're just going to ignore it because 10% is only 10%. So to my mind, there's an element of saying, where does the data lead us, and what strength of realism is there, or what data is there to say that when I turn up to any one of these given buildings, that piece of equipment is actually going to do its job. And that's where you get your maintenance and your certification and your oversight, which everybody should have to do, in the hope that it will never be needed in that particular building. Whereas I think a lot of people look at it in fire risk assessment terms at the moment, is that they don't even bother to test that, because the assessment in their mind is, well, we'll never need it anyway. So we're just going around and ticking a box, £300, move on to the next building. But that would be data driven, because that's just looking and saying, across my portfolio, what percentage of buildings is the dry riser effectively in good repair, or so it becomes a compliance thing. But we're seeing no evidence of that being done at scale at the moment. But lots of people are running around drilling holes in external facades, where actually the evidence doesn't point, apart from Grenfell, to the external facade causing a statistically measurable number of deaths, thankfully. But we're throwing all of our policy effort at the external wall and ignoring the inside. And to me, I can't square this from data, because I know it all kind of needs to be done and understood, but I feel like we're floundering around with a complete lack of data, because we're taking a low probability, high consequence events and applying that as a method to every building, and using it as a means of bankrupting people. I'm lost, I think, without the data.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, so because there are less fires, the number of fires are going down in dwelling fires, we know that. So you're less likely to have a fire. What we found was actually that when a fire occurs, you are just as likely now as you were 20 years ago to get injured, and arguably more so. So again, it's this partial policy of, yes, fires are going down. We don't entirely know why. Some of that will be driven by prevention activity. Some of it's by product changes. So moving to different types of fat fryers and, rather than open ones. So there's a whole range of things that have influenced that, but that's great. Numbers of fires going down. But actually, when it occurs, although it's a very low likelihood, the chance of being injured hasn't changed. So it's an area where we haven't had any real policy or research work. And it comes to your point that I think everyone's seen it through a very narrow lens. I couldn't find hardly any information about fire extinguishers, because somewhere in the process it's not been deemed important. But you think, we know these are an incredibly important way to mitigate fires in the early stages. Why are we not curious? Why are we not wanting to say every time one's used, there would be something we could learn? And I think, as I say, coming back to particularly now, the advantage we've got with machine learning and things like that, we can capture data quickly, we can process it quickly. Are we any better connected now? Would we spot the next Grenfell from UK or global trends, I'm not seeing where that data's going in, being processed, where somebody's saying something's changing here. I'm not sure we're any further forward. I'm not sure we understand risk any better in terms of, as you say, with the walking watches and the waking watches. Have we learned anything through that process? I'm not sure. We seem to be happy. We have a compliance culture. So if you tell us what needs to be done, by and large, it'll get done. Nowhere in that is somebody saying, that's not enough. You know, go out, find the new things, be curious, ask the questions, look at the whole picture, not just that bit of it. And it's nobody's responsibility, because nobody overall owns fire safety. We all make a contribution. Yeah. And it's the same we found with the burn survivor. Nobody owns the burn survivor journey. So you get this sum of the parts. Everyone means well, they do a bit, but it's not informed by the end-to-end needs of the burn survivor, or, as we're talking about, the residents. What would it take for me as a resident to feel and be safe in my property? Or in the event that there is a fire occurs, what is it I'm likely to do, and what do I need for you to keep me safe whilst achieving the things that are important to me? That takes you to a different place. It's a very different language. And as I say, social sciences and residents' voices are very poorly represented generally, if they're represented at all. And where they are, it's on the basis of what organisations have asked through their lens, in terms of what do we want to know about you. It skews the data, it skews our understanding. And I think the other bit I would always be mindful of is case studies. Grenfell will hopefully have a huge impact for the right reasons on fire safety. Thankfully, it's atypical. It's not the sort of fire we see very often, but there would have been probably 100 events that could have gone to Grenfell that are lost in data because they were only small fires, and so we took no notice. Yeah. And I think if we need to learn the lessons from Grenfell and the other major tragedies, but we also need to remember they are atypical and not representative. And if we take them as such, we end up with policies that are missing the point of all the other times it didn't happen, and not putting it into context. And I think case studies are powerful. We remember those for the right reasons, but equally, as you say, we also need to ground them in solid data of, is it, what made that different? You know, thankfully we don't see those very often. So what were the circumstances that made that different, both in terms of the conditions, the response? I'm not sure we're necessarily going to get all of that from the inquiry. Hopefully we'll get most of it. But I always come back, it's a human story first and foremost. And we haven't got a human story and human narrative in legislation. Legislation is not written in a human way.
Is there a risk though with the findings of the inquiry that we're taking responses to a thankfully anomalous event and applying that to the mass, in the sense that could you end up with a massive overreaction to the problem if you look at it logically and with evidence to say, actually that response, yes, it probably would have helped on this occasion, but actually you're sort of assuming that that's the norm when actually this wasn't the norm. That's we've got all these layers of complexity coming through, and I just know practically when you put too much complexity on organisations that very little gets done, and then potentially the one thing buried within the 100 that would make the real difference is one of the ones that gets ignored. And I don't think we know all of these different layers we're looking at putting on, which are the ones that would, from an evidence perspective, would make a disproportionate amount of positive difference. And that's back to the risk management point, I think, and lack of data.
It is, and I do think you're right. I suspect that in some places the risk of another Grenfell will be misapplied and used as an argument to enforce a level of protection that is probably not required for the circumstance. And I think, as I say, we have this very, I don't know why fire suffers from this, but it seems to have this very generic model, which is to say that you're always assuming that somebody could die and it's a worst case fire and it's going to, the house will burn in seconds, and it's possible. And it's not to say that's not, and there's been examples of that through history, but we also see thousands of fires every year that don't perform to that. And as I say, in dwelling fires, come back to that, 70 to 80% of people are not calling the fire service to fires they have in their home.
Yeah.
Not because they're stupid, not because they're taking chances. They just don't need to. They can deal with it safely, even without support from the professional services. They deal with it safely. So I think you're right. We don't want to get complexity for the sake of complexity. But I think if we've got to know what we're talking about, I spent 30 years in the fire service, and it was only at the last bit where I did some studying. I actually learned risk management as a subject. I'd spent all my career talking about and applying risk but without necessarily understanding it as a topic.
Yeah.
So you come at it a slightly different angle. It's not to say, we don't know risk, but we don't understand it in a way that I could then have a conversation with a professional like yourself or an insurer, where we've got a common language, and actually we can also have that with the public. And so I think complexity for the sake of it is not helpful, but nor is uniformity and assuming that everything's the worst case when the evidence clearly tells us, thankfully, that's not the case. So one of the points of distinction for me is, after all this time, if you look at the data, what are the fires the public can safely deal with, and what are the ones we should say to them, if you see these conditions, that's when you need to call somebody. It's slightly different because depending on your ability and the circumstances, but it has to be a move in the right direction to be able to give some sort of criteria as a professional service to the public to say, if you see any of these things, you should call us then. But you can't just keep shouting at people to call the fire service when the reality is it's not landing. You've just got this, this gap between the public assumptions and what's happening, and you can't move forward with that degree of space between them. So it's down to the professions to close that in all aspects of the fire safety environment, I think. But we've got to have more nuance than we do now, and we've got to understand, if nothing else, there's the difference between the likelihood of fatal fires and the ones that thankfully are most at risk is of a minor injury, which accounts for the majority of fires people experience. But even with those, it's very unlikely people will get injured in dealing with it. So there's some different conversations to have. It's not one solution fits all, which is what we've got now, and it's all based on that worst case, which is to say not where we are in terms of what most people would experience, if they experience it at all.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to draw things to a close because we've had a great conversation, but I think I would just hope that this has been helpful for people to watch. I mean, if they can contact you or download the report and have a read of that and let you know what they think. But also, we've got some new leadership coming in at the senior end of the fire service now. Maybe that will bring a different, potentially a different approach. Who knows? Let's see what happens. I think the main thing is we're having the conversation. We're having these sorts of conversations. We're being open with the public. We're not just patting them on the head and saying, your residents, what do you know about this? We're having these conversations. I think, we all need to get together and discuss the issues and move things forward. So, David, thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Matt, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.